Mr. Speaker.
Andrew Bailey.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to be talking on the Residential Tenancies Safe and Secure Rentals Amendment Bill. Gee, we've listened to a bit of dribble tonight, Mr. Speaker. Comments like National's not interested in seeing people living in homes that don't recognise that a home is an anchor for a family, all that tripe. Mr. Speaker, this government has done a lot around trying to get people into homes, into their own homes, Mr. Speaker. That's what we've been doing. That's what National's about. And all these allegations that we're not interested and we're not protecting tenants is just dribble, Mr. Speaker. And the worst thing about this bill, Mr. Speaker, I think the member who's prepared this bill simply has not done their homework. So I just want to touch on a couple of points. The first thing is the right of renewal. I note the term right of renewal, which means that the existing tenant will have the first right of renewal once the fixed term expires. And this is because, in the words of the Act or the bill, that will reward good tenants and encourage good relationships. Well, Mr. Speaker, if there are good relationships and there are good tenants and good landlords, that will automatically happen. The thing I find most intriguing is that if you refer to clause or section 60B of the Act, the existing Act, it already provides for that. It provides that the landlord must give, there must be a notice given by the tenant. If the tenant gives it within 21 working days, then there is a rollover of the provisions. So, Mr. Speaker, the provision's already in the Act. The second thing is require landlords to state that the criteria of future rent rises. Now, Mr. Speaker, I suggest the member who proposed this bill has probably never entered into a commercial relationship in terms of rental of industrial or commercial property, because commercial rentals agreements are always of this nature. They always cover this issue, and they're the most contentious part of any tenancy agreement. And they normally provide for things like CPI adjustment or market-based rentals. Mr. Speaker, even if you wrote market-based rentals, it wouldn't make any difference. They would still be contentious when they were required to have a rental review. The third one, and I also note under section 25 of the existing Act, gives the Tenancy Tribunal the right to reduce rentals if they're excessive. The third one, ensure the tenants may no longer be charged for letting fees. Well, sorry, Mr. Speaker, section 13A already states that the tenants shall pay any fee, that the landlord must state whether the tenant's going to pay any of these fees. Already covered it, Mr. Speaker. Fourth one, create a minimum period of 3 years for a fixed-term rental. Mr. Speaker, people want flexibility. I rent a property. I want flexibility. And you could see the perverse case where it'll be in the interest of tenants not to actually enter and specify a case. So they could keep the options open, knowing that the minimum would be 3 years, but that may not necessarily be in the best interest of the landlord. And where there are poor tenants, Mr. Speaker, landlords do need to have their appropriate rights to look after and uphold their property. And also prohibit rent rises more than once every 12 months. Difficult one, this one, Mr. Speaker, given the type of tenancy you were talking about here. I'm not so sure about that. The repeal of the 42-day notice, I think the member doesn't understand current provisions, because the current Act requires that 42 days notice can only apply after an unconditional offer has been agreed and the purchaser requires vacant possession. There's two tests to it, Mr. Speaker. So that puts a much longer period on that. Mr. Speaker, I wish this bill had actually focused on more important things relating to methamphetamine and rental properties. And I think this is a very important part that could have been in this bill and unfortunately hasn't been initially could be included in this bill. And so, Mr. Speaker, I would like to see that those provisions actually covered, because those are the types of things that would protect our tenants, particularly around where landlords are required to tell tenants where, if they're aware of methamphetamine contamination, and to make sure that they don't allow people to live in contaminated premises. So, Mr. Speaker, I cannot support this bill. I think most of these provisions are already covered in the Act.